Welcome back to the channel, where myth meets evidence and the old world echoes through the bones of the past. Today, we're telling a story of ice, endurance, and eventual retreat. A real-life saga that lasted 5 centuries, a Norse experiment in survival at the edge of the known world. This is the story of Norse Greenland. Imagine this. You're a Viking settler in the late 900s, sailing west into the unknown, guided only by rumor and exile. You land on a vast, rugged island. Ice grips its edges. The wind stings like needles. But there's land to farm, fjords to fish, and a future to build. That's what Erik the Red promised in 986 AD when he founded the eastern settlement in Greenland. A few hundred families followed him, carving homes out of stone and turf. Soon after, a second colony, the Western Settlement, was established about 400 kilometers north. For a while, it worked. They farmed, they traded, they built churches. By 1124, they even had a bishop at Gardar. That doesn't happen unless there's real prosperity. But this wasn't Iceland. Greenland tested everything. So how did it all unravel? To answer that, we need to do what modern researchers did, look inside the bones. Literally, recent scientific analysis of Norse skeletal remains has opened a window into their world. Dental enamel, locked with oxygen isotopes, records ancient climate shifts, and what it tells us is brutal. Between 1000 and 1300 AD, Greenland's climate dropped by about 6 degrees Celsius. That's not a mild winter. That's generational cold. The grass grew slower. The winters got longer. What once fed your cattle now barely covered the ground. You can see the consequences in their teeth and in their trash. Early settlers ate mostly land-based food, cattle, sheep, goats, classic Norse diet. But as the cold deepened, the isotopes show a shift. More marine protein, less livestock. They started eating more seal, fish, and seabirds. Middens, their garbage dumps, back it up. Bones from sea creatures start outnumbering bones from farm animals. This wasn't some culinary revolution. This was survival. And the settlements weren't equal. The eastern settlement had better land, more people, and more resilience. The western settlement, only a third the size, always more vulnerable. For years, we thought 4,000 to 6,000 Norse lived in Greenland. Turns out, it was more like 1,500 to 2,000 at peak. A small, tight-knit population trying to maintain a European lifestyle on Arctic soil. Mathematical models suggest they started with around 500 settlers. With modest growth, they reached peak numbers by the 12th century. But it only took a few people leaving each year, just 8, to start a steady population decline. And once the numbers drop too low, you lose kids, you lose future generations, you lose your ability to adapt. What's wild is they stayed culturally connected to Europe the whole time. Burials in Greenland mirrored European styles almost perfectly. Even tiny details, like how arms were crossed or laid, changed over time the same way they did on the mainland. That tells us something important. They weren't cut off. They weren't going native. They were holding the line, defending a way of life. But that may have been their undoing. They were farmers, not fishermen. They believed prosperity meant livestock, not seal meat. They built churches when they needed boats. Even as they adapted, they stayed tied to the old ways. Their identity, rooted in land, animals, faith, and Europe, wouldn't bend far enough to survive what Greenland threw at them. So what finally happened? No mass graves, no burned villages, no signs of war, just silence. The Western settlement vanished first, around the mid-13th century. The eastern settlement lingered another century. Demographic modeling and archaeological clues suggest a slow fade. Emigration, infertility, hardship. Not one dramatic collapse, but a long, quiet retreat. And what about the Inuit? Some legends claimed the Norse were absorbed. Genetic data says otherwise. Modern Greenlandic Inuit show no mitochondrial DNA from Norse women. Y chromosome analysis shows some European male ancestry, but it likely came from later Danish colonizers, not medieval settlers. So no, they didn't disappear into the Arctic. They left. But why leave then? Well, timing matters. Back in Europe, the Black Death ravaged populations, but that meant land opened up. In Iceland, prime farmland became available. If you're scraping by in Greenland and you hear there's open pasture in your ancestral homeland, that's not just a better option, it's a lifeline. You pack up, you sail back, you choose your culture over your coordinates. They didn't fail, they chose. And that's the heart of the Norse Greenland story. It wasn't a saga of savagery or sudden death. It was a case study in long-term adaptation, cultural tension, and the limits of survival. They did everything right, up to a point. They adjusted, they held on, they endured. But in the end, they wouldn't let go of who they were to become something new. They didn't want to be seal hunters. They wanted to be Norse farmers. And when that wasn't possible anymore, they walked away. This wasn't collapse. This was a calculated withdrawal, a decision to preserve their identity, even if it meant abandoning the land they'd held for 500 years. And maybe that's the real mythic lesson buried in the frost. Sometimes, the strongest act of survival isn't staying, it's knowing when to leave. Thanks for watching. If this kind of deep dive into real Norse history speaks to you, hit subscribe, drop a comment, and share this with someone who still thinks the Vikings just vanished. Because the truth, they made it out, and they took their stories with them.